Welcome back. I hope the food was okay for you. Um, and I'm trying to not repeat my mistakes. So we're starting almost on time now with Norbert telling us about Storybook.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about Storybook today. And just to get some sort of information for me is like I would like to know that the stuff that I work on is meaningful to people. So if you've ever heard of Storybook before, raise your hand. If you've ever used it, all right, that's cool. I think it's amazing to see people use the stuff that you've built. You've probably had that experience yourself. So asking that, yeah, makes people feel good. So yeah, let's dive into the story of Storybook, the history, how I personally got involved, and how I became to be an open source full time maintainer of it. So it's an interesting story. Um, Storybook was originally created by Aranoda, who was a really well known person in the Meteor community. So Meteor was something that was pretty cutting edge quite a few years ago. The Meteor team nowadays kind of work on Apollo, so they're really smart people. And a startup, I think in Sri Lanka, led by Aranoda. Can we close the door? Um, they were working on Storybook and they released version 1. And then a few months later, they released version 2. But Kadira itself wasn't doing all that great. And at some point, as many startups do, they had to close down. And so they also closed down Storybook. It was an open source project, but like no one was maintaining it. And this lasted for about 3 months. Now, I was a front end consultant in the Netherlands. That's where I'm from. And yeah, I was one of my clients, and they were using Storybook, and so I was introduced to it by them. And what I saw was that it helped junior developers get on board onto their massive, massive e-commerce platform. It would take you like an hour to build the thing locally in your machine. It would probably take you an entire week just to get everything set up. And so Storybook was helping them by creating this little playground where they can just start Storybook in about a minute, and they could start working on one component in isolation. Don't have to worry about the backend being flaky, et cetera, et cetera. And it also helped them kind of document the stuff that they were building, all the components that they were building in their really large application. They were migrating from like all server side rendered in some Java stack to front end using React. So they kind of asked me like, hey, can we get more of Storybook's features and more of Storybook's perks in our workflow? And so that's what I was doing with them. And then I got the information from one of the other Storybook collaborators that Storybook was unmaintained and abandoned by its original authors. And I was like, that's not really good. Like this company that really relies on it and other companies are relying on it. This open source project that I've really grown to like, I was writing add-ons for it at that point. I wanted to stay in existence and not have to find something else to work on. I had tipped my toes in the water of open source before, like I had done some documentation PRs on Webpack and on Babel. I'd never really taken maintenance of something. As a consultant, you kind of like jump into and make stuff better and then jump out and you repeat that process. So I was kind of interested in getting on board on this maintenance team. And so I posted on GitHub, and like that issue is actually right there. Is this project dead? I responded there saying like, hey, and I tagged Aranoda. If you're looking for a new maintainer, I'm willing to do it. And then I went to bed, and the next morning I checked my email, and there was an email from GitHub stating that I was the new administrator on the Storybook organization. I was called on my bluff because actually I didn't really know how to maintain Storybook. I had maybe looked twice at the code base before. So what do? I open a Google Hangout and I invite as many people as I can. Like literally, I would just do at here in the Slack. Like, hey, I want to talk with you about the future of Storybook. I care about it. If you care about it, come join me and let's talk. I recorded that meeting, so if you're interested in how that went and how awkward it was with 10 people on the internet, never seen each other before, you can still see that today. But we actually had a lot of fun. Like everyone came there with the idea of like, oh, we don't want Storybook to die. We want to help maintain this thing. Everyone kind of had their own angle. Like some people were consulting and they had really specialized in how Storybook worked and help people with that workflow. And so, yeah, we kind of created a new core team from that meeting. And then, like, I did some pretty rough, hardcore engineering because, like, it was about 30 repos scattered around GitHub, all using their own test frameworks or not being tested at all. They're all using their own like special build tools. Some were in TypeScript, some were in Flow, some were in just plain ES5. And so I merged all of that in a single monorepo. It took me about 3 weeks. Um, and then really, I figured like I'm probably not going to be doing this for forever, right? I just want to kind of make sure that Storybook's maintained and Storybook just keeps being alive so I can keep doing my job. And then after a few months, I would just onboard more and more people, have more one-on-one meetings with people that said, "Hey, I'm interested in fixing this bug for you." I would just spend about an hour talking to them, like, "Hey, this is how Storybook works. This is the repository. This is how you set it up," and all that kind of stuff. And then after a few months, I would just like sneak out, so no one would notice probably. But it just turns out that it was so much fun meeting all these new people, and there was such interesting stuff to be working on in Storybook. I just never stopped. I've been maintaining Storybook for about 2 years now, and I'm still having a blast meeting new people and meeting the people that I've known for about 2 years now. And as you can see in the graph, what ended up happening is like when the community took over of Storybook, we kind of rebranded. And then about a year later, we rebranded again to a simplified logo that is way easier to use. I can tell you this, all these messy colors is a lot harder to actually get into print and stuff. And we started to support more UI libraries like Storybook originally. It was for React and React Native or only. I visited a meetup in Amsterdam for Vue, mostly for shits and giggles because I was not going to be using Vue, whatever. But I felt like it would be nice to meet new people and kind of get out of my own React bubble. And so it was on my train trip home, and I figured like, how hard would it be to make a storybook for Vue? And it turns out in 1.5 hours, I had a working prototype. So I kind of pushed that into the storybook uh, maintenance team, and really like with the idea of like, well, what if Storybook isn't like React focused, and what if like these concerns that Storybook solves, like component driven development, they're not React specific at all. And then about a year ago, maybe 1.5 years ago, a company approached me called Chroma, and they asked me like, "Hey, we've built a product on top of Storybook, and we want Storybook to grow and be maintained well. You've been doing that already in your spare time. How about you do that like in our time?" So yeah, I joined an American startup. I work remotely from home. My job officially is to make sure that Storybook is maintained well and grows. And I think we've done that. Just to solidify that thought, like these are just a few companies that use Storybook on the world. And the idea is that regardless of your UI library, regardless of your framework, you want to be building modern UIs. Those are built using components. They make it that it's faster, more durable. You want to have reusable code so you don't repeat yourself. Um, what UI engineers usually do, at least this is in my experience, is you get this sort of thing delivered to you. This is what a designer works in. Um, and there's like a lot of complexity here, right? It's kind of the table stakes. You've got all sorts of screens and pages, but really, when you look at this, like as an engineer, you think like, okay, let's take this screen and decompose it, and then catalog all of the relevant states of all those components, and then work on all of those states and all those components in complete isolation, because if a component works in isolation, it is far more likely to work in your coherent overall application. And then recombine those small atomic components into higher level components, and recompose those higher level components back into screens. And that's really all Storybook is about. And this workflow is what we call the component-driven development, or CDD for short. So new stuff in Storybook, because we've been really busy. If you're using React, then you can now use React hooks in Storybook. If you want finer control over Storybook, this is like an epic that we're on to make sure that Storybook is customizable, but in a way that is maintainable for us. I think Tobias could probably say something about customizations and extensibility and that kind of, and how that involves maintenance and versioning. So we want to be really careful on like what you can customize of Storybook without it being a nightmare to maintain for us. So about this, you can now have more finer control over which stories appear where in the navigation panel. For about 6 months or 7 months, we've been migrating to TypeScript. I would say we're at like 70 to 80% right now. And this is really thanks to our adoption of multiple frameworks. So it's actually the Angular community that has really stepped up and helped us migrate to TypeScript. Had I not done that original prototype with Vue, we would have never started like collaborating with Vue and thus with Angular teams and started working on Storybook for Angular. And we probably would not have been able to migrate to TypeScript because it actually takes a bit of knowledge to do so. We have new add-on APIs. So this again comes down to customizability. You can do a whole bunch of more things with Storybook now, and as an add-on creator, you can get access to whatever is rendered in a panel or in a preview or in the navigation panel. You can do all sorts of cool stuff. Kind of building up more and more important features. Documentation is definitely a huge one. So when I started using Storybook, like I said, it was kind of this playground where you can see one component at one time and kind of work on it in isolation. But the documentation side was always been an afterthought. It's just kind of, it was sort of a side effect of what Storybook does. But when you want to tell people about this amazing component that you've written, it doesn't really help you per se to show that one component in one state. You might want to talk about component and really convince people like this tooltip component that I've written is the best tooltip component and it's the last one you're ever going to need. And that's really what documentation is about solidifying the knowledge and also conveying the information of like why. So in Storybook 5.2, you can now auto-generate pages like this, where you give it a component and some markdown, and then boom, it just automatically generates a page where You see the prop types, you see what events it listens to, etc. Now, if this automatic generation is not enough for you, we actually give you full control over this page using MDX. And then following, you can use the doc blocks that we've written to make this auto-generated page. You can use those so you don't have to write your own prop tables component or your own preview component or your own component to show off the amazing colors that you're using. And this is what such an MDX file could look like. As you see, it can look pretty nice. You can import any component you want. You can even render components there in line. But you can also reference stories that might be defined somewhere else, and Storybook will figure out where those are and render them in an iframe. So raise your hand if you want to build your components in isolation, get example-based documentation, and enhance using MDX. We actually use Storybook for developing storybooks. So like I look at the application all day, and it's sometimes very meta because like I'll have the navigation panel inside of the preview area of, and then externally a Storybook, and I see the navigation panel again. So Storybook has had this API of like stories of and .add. If you've ever used it, you'll know this. And it's kind of like a jQuery-esque way of writing tests, I would say. And I'd never been a fan. Like by now, everyone looks at me when they think of like Storybook and stuff. But like 99% of the APIs I would never have written if I had the choice. But you want to be careful when you're breaking things or you're making like big drastic changes, right? So over the last year, we've been experimenting with this. And it's now fully released and you can start using it. It's called the component story format, or CSF for short. And this is what it looks like. And this is actually a way that Storybook can now consume stories. So you write a file like this and Storybook will understand, oh, so normal is actually a story, link is a story, and loading is a story. Now, what's great is that you can see that there's absolutely no reference to Storybook at all. So this file can also be read and written to by other tools, like design tools, like InVision is starting to use this. And if you're thinking like, I've got thousands of stories, how am I going to rewrite them all? Well, luckily we've written a code mod for you to do so. So you can likely migrate to CSF in one command. And it should result in less lines of code. At least it did for us. So that's a nice PR. Cool. So future stuff. So all the stuff I just showed you, you can start using today. This is stuff that we're working on. You being able to embed stories inside of other documentation sites. So we don't want to be in competition with something like Next or Gatsby. We think those are fantastic tools that serve their own purpose. And we don't want to be building like the next Gatsby or something. We don't think that's a good use of our time. We'd rather collaborate. And so we want you to be able to inject stories or Storybook bits into other doc sites. We also want to collaborate with something like Code Sandbox or some other JS Fiddle-like tool. So you can edit your stories and your components code right within Storybook, even if it's statically built. So you can experiment and get an even richer experience of like what happens if I pass this other prop in, etc. And then exporting a story or a component to Code Sandbox could help a lot with like bug tracing and creating reproductions. The way Storybook is configured right now is also not how I would have designed it if I had the choice. But again, it's one of those things you have to be really careful of if you want to change these. But we are going to be changing how Storybook is configured in a backwards compatible way. So this is going to be released in version 5.3. It's going to be a declarative way of writing configuration for Storybook, which will also give external tools some more information of like what stories are out there, which currently you actually need to run Storybook for in order to know. And then one universal Storybook means that if you want to use Storybook right now, you kind of have to choose one framework and not two. If you choose two, then you kind of need to run Storybook twice in two different ways. What we're aiming at is that you can run Storybook, and each story can essentially run either in Angular or in React or in Preact, whichever you want, and Storybook can figure that out for you. So this is particularly useful if you're using two frameworks, which might surprise you, but a lot of companies actually do because they're either migrating or B, they want to be future proof. And then a lot of developers actually think of stories as sort of tests. And so what if you could analyze how much coverage you've got? Like unit tests usually have some sort of coverage reporting. Well, if stories are tests, then why not have coverage about like how much code am I hitting when I'm rendering all of my stories? We have a working prototype that does this. What is really weird is like, where do we show this data? And that's kind of where we're kind of like, we're all cool engineering folks, but how do you show this in a good user way? So if you are a designer or know a good designer who could collaborate with us to kind of make it have a good place in the Historic UI, would be really welcome that. And then I'm almost at the last part of my presentation. That is, UI states are combinatorial. Hopefully I pronounced that correct. So imagine you have one component and this one component has 4 states. That component could possibly or maybe render in like 4 browsers, maybe on like 4 devices. And then you might want to make sure that it is accessible for people with different types of disabilities. That's a lot of tests. That's a lot of stuff you need to check. And if you're going to be doing that manually, you better have like, I don't know. I don't think that's really doable. You kind of probably do like some happy path optimization, or like, all right, I'm just going to check a few things. So what if you could check it all? Well, that's actually the idea behind Chromatic. So Chroma, the company that is paying me to work in open source full time, to work in Storybook, they have built this product on top of Storybook, and they allow you to do visual regression testing or visual review on top of Storybook. So all of your stories, they get snapshotted using the browser that you want. And then anyone on your team, either yourself or your product owner or your designer, can go into the tool and approve or deny changes when they are discovered. So based on a PR, you get a list of all the visual changes, and then you get to say whether those changes are desired or not. And one of our killing features is that we are really well and really integrated with Storybook. And so we can do this snapshotting really fast. This is an actual screenshot. We're doing 2,234 tests or stories and diffing them in 45 seconds. That's it. Any questions? I can hear you. I can repeat the question if you want.
Cool. I'm Dutchleo. I work with Trivago.
Hi.
One of the teams, and yeah. So we're adapting Storybook to our workflow. So I'm wondering what's the best practice to integrate workflow. To integrate Storybook to our workflow. And question about CSS. So with CSF, what's the best practice for naming? Because we have all these name import, and the variable names are actually the stories. So I'm wondering if you have any advice.
So you can export only like certain things. Like for example, I think an export cannot start with a number, and you cannot have, for example, default as a name and some other reserved names in the JavaScript language. But the way you can get around that is by adding like a static property on top of the function that you're exporting, like display name on a React component, something like that. What the best practice is really up to you. Like Storybook doesn't really care if you're doing atomic design with atoms and higher, and you want to categorize your components or not. Like we see some teams do it, we see some teams not do it, and they both seem pretty happy with it. Like, so I don't know. I don't I don't have an opinion on it. Although I think like if you're really into atomic design, like, and you want to categorize your components, I found that to be like more time consuming than it was worth to me. But I definitely like the idea of like certain features grouping components together and then having like a big shared library, something like that. And I think your first question was like, how do you start adopting Storybook in your current workflow? I would say like if you've got a few components that are shared across your entire organization, do those first. And then write all of their states or as many states as you feel like should at least be inspectable by people at a first glance. And then, yeah, deploy your Storybook on every commit. It can really help to get people to find it and to use it.
Got it. Thanks.
Any other questions?
I might have missed it, but what does MDX actually stand for?
So MD is usually short for Markdown, and then the X is for extended or XML. So it's kind of Markdown extended with JavaScript or JSX. It's kind of JavaScript and Markdown pushed into a single file. Okay.